Lower Saxony, British occupation zone. September 1946. The rain came down in sheets across the heath, turning the compound into a landscape of mud and grey sky that seemed to stretch endlessly toward a horizon no one could quite see. The women's camp sat just outside Hanover, a collection of Nissen huts arranged with the geometric precision that spoke of British military efficiency, surrounded by barbed wire that had been maintained with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized everything the British did. Annalisa, 28, a former clerk in the Luftwaffe Communications Division, who had spent the final years of the war filing reports she no longer believed mattered, stood in the assembly hall with 189 other German women, all of them waiting for an announcement that felt different from the usual roster calls and work assignments. The camp commandant, Colonel Henry Dalton from Yorkshire, had ordered all women to assemble after the midday meal. It was highly irregular. The British ran their operations with clockwork precision, and deviations from routine were rare enough to inspire anxiety. There was something in the air today, a kind of nervous energy among the guards, the way they stood slightly more rigid than usual, the way the senior staff had gathered in a cluster near the platform, conferring in low voices. Annalisa felt her chest tighten. She had learned during her months here that when the British changed their routines, it usually meant something significant was happening beyond the fence, in the larger machinery of occupation that controlled all their lives. Around her, the women whispered in German, their voices creating a cases of speculation beneath the drumming of rain on the corrugated roof. Rumors had been circulating for weeks. They were being transferred to work camps in Belgium, sent to clear rubble in bombed cities, shipped to Scotland to work on farms. One woman insisted she had heard guards discussing repatriation, though no one quite believed it. Germany was divided now, carved up among the victors, and returning home meant returning to zones controlled by different powers, to cities that existed now only as ruins and occupation zones. Annalisa had arrived at this camp in June, transferred from a larger detention facility after a British officer had noticed her fluency in English during a routine interview. She had learned English from her grandmother, who had lived in London before the First War, and had taught Annalisa to speak with careful pronunciation and proper grammar. That skill had kept her alive during the final collapse of the Reich, had made her useful to the British administration, had landed her here in this particular camp rather than somewhere worse. She had never expected to survive the war. As Germany collapsed around her, as the Allies closed in from all sides, she had assumed death would come suddenly, violently, the way it had come to so many others. Instead, she had surrendered to British soldiers in May 1945, been processed through a detention center in Hamburg, and found herself in this strange limbo where the war was over. But its consequences continued to unfold with bureaucratic slowness. Colonel Dalton stepped forward, and the assembled women fell silent with the automatic discipline that months of British supervision had instilled in them. He was a tall man, perhaps in his late 50s, with the bearing of someone who had served through both wars and carried the weight of those years in the lines of his face. He held several folders under his arm, and his expression was carefully neutral, the face of a man about to deliver information he had not entirely chosen to deliver. "I am going to explain a situation to you," he began, his English clipped and precise in the way that only a certain class of British officer could achieve. A translator, a woman named Greta, who had worked as a teacher in Berlin, repeated his words in German, though many of the women understood English well enough to follow. "The war has concluded. You have been detained and processed according to international law and the terms of the German surrender. You have been provided with accommodation, sustenance, and medical care as required by the Geneva Convention. However, your status remains that of civilian internees awaiting final disposition. The British government is now in the process of determining what that final disposition shall be." Annalisa found herself holding her breath. Something was coming, something that would change everything. "Britain requires labor for reconstruction," Colonel Dalton continued. "Your nation participated in the destruction of much of Europe. Europe must now be rebuilt. His Majesty's government is prepared to offer contracts to women who wish to participate in organized work programs. These contracts will be administered through the Ministry of Labor and will provide wages, housing, and conditions appropriate to civilian workers. You will work where British authorities assign you. Your status will change from intern to contracted laborer. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was unexpected. Work contracts meant something closer to freedom, even if that freedom was limited and conditional. However, Dalton said, and here his tone shifted slightly, becoming more careful, more measured. There is an additional matter that must be addressed. A number of British servicemen stationed in this region have made inquiries regarding the possibility of forming attachments with women currently detained in this facility. The hall went utterly silent. Even the rain seemed to pause. These inquiries, Dalton continued, have been reviewed by military legal counsel and by civilian authorities. The position of His Majesty's government is that while such attachments are unusual, they are not strictly prohibited under current regulations. Marriage between British subjects and German nationals is not illegal, though it is subject to significant restrictions and requires approval from military authorities. Annalisa felt the word settle over her like frost, slowly obscuring everything that had seemed clear moments before. Marriage. The word seemed impossible, incomprehensible, like suggesting a woman should transform into smoke. Therefore, Dalton announced the following procedure will be implemented. Any woman who wishes to be considered for a work contract may volunteer for such consideration. Additionally, any woman who is willing to receive a proposal of marriage from a British serviceman may indicate this willingness. Those women will be granted supervised meetings with servicemen who have expressed interest in marriage. These meetings will be conducted with propriety and under observation. You will hear their proposals. You will accept or decline as you see fit. He paused, allowing the translator to catch up. What you cannot do is remain in this camp indefinitely. This facility will be decommissioned by February 1947. All women must either accept work contracts, arrange for repatriation to appropriate zones in Germany, or if applicable, complete marriage proceedings with approved British subjects. A marriage that receives official approval will result in immediate transfer to British civilian custody with housing and treatment equivalent to that of a British subject's dependent. Colonel Dalton looked out across the assembled women, his expression carefully controlled. I want to be entirely clear, he said. No woman will be forced into marriage. No woman will face punishment for refusing a proposal. This is being offered as an option, nothing more. However, those who decline both work contracts and marriage proposals will be subject to repatriation proceedings which may result in transfer to zones under different occupation authorities. The choice within these parameters is yours. He turned and walked out, followed by the other officers before anyone could formulate questions, though no one was quite certain what questions to ask. That night, the Nissen huts erupted in anxious conversation. Women who had maintained careful distance throughout months of detention suddenly clustered together, their voices rising and falling in urgent debate. Some insisted this was a trap, another form of humiliation designed to degrade them further. Others whispered that it might represent an opportunity, a way out of the grinding uncertainty of displacement. A few, the practical ones, began calculating odds, weighing options, trying to determine which path led towards survival. Annala sat on her bunk and thought about the towel the British had issued her when she first arrived at the camp. It had been clean, regulation white, precisely folded. She had been told to wash daily, given soap that actually adhered, provided with facilities that worked. The British were not cruel, but they were exacting. Everything had rules, procedures, proper forms to be filled out in triplicate. This announcement fit that pattern. Even marriage, it seemed, would be administered with bureaucratic precision. She thought about what marriage meant. She had been engaged before the war to a boy named Heinrich who had died in France in 1940. She had loved him with the certainty of youth, with the assumption that futures were guaranteed and love was permanent. When the telegram came, she had mourned him, but she had also been released from expectations, freed someone other than Heinrich's wife. The idea of marrying now in detention to a stranger from the nation that had bombed her cities seemed like a betrayal of something she could not quite name. And yet remaining felt equally impossible. Repatriation meant returning to a Germany that no longer existed, to a Soviet zone or an American zone or a French zone, each with its own rules and dangers. The next morning, Annalisa was not scheduled for any meetings. Most women were not. Colonel Dalton's announcement had created complications that the British military establishment had apparently not fully anticipated. The servicemen who had made inquiries, it turned out, were fewer in number than the administration had perhaps expected, and those who had expressed interest were discovering that the reality of actually proposing to a German woman, of contemplating marriage to someone from the enemy nation, was considerably more complex than abstract interest had suggested. By the third day, only 18 women had been offered proposals. Some had accepted. A dark-haired woman named Frida from Dresden had agreed to marry a sergeant named William Campbell, a Scotsman whose own family had been killed in the Blitz, and who seemed to be seeking something Annalisa could not quite understand, some form of forgiveness or connection that transcended national boundaries. They looked at each other with a kind of desperate recognition, as though both understood they were refugees seeking shelter in an arrangement that made no sense to anyone else. Others had refused. A woman named Helga, who had worked as a nurse during the war, and had seen more death than most, had turned down 2 proposals without hesitation. "I did not survive the war to become a British soldier's wife," she had said loudly enough for others to hear. "I am German. That will not change regardless of whom I marry." By the second week, Annalisa had begun to think she might avoid the marriage system entirely. She was not beautiful in the obvious way some women were, and her English, while fluent, seemed to make her less exotic somehow, more like an interpreter than a romantic possibility. She had resigned herself to accepting a work contract, to becoming a laborer in some British reconstruction project, when on a Tuesday morning in October, she was called to the administration building. She expected Colonel Dalton, but instead found a different officer, younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with fair hair and an expression that suggested competing thoughts held in careful balance. His name was Captain Thomas Harding, stationed with the Civil Affairs Unit in Hamburg, working on displaced persons and reconstruction administration. He had served in the war as an intelligence officer, had seen combat in North Africa and Italy, and had decided after the war ended that he would remain in Germany to help manage the aftermath rather than return immediately to his law practice in London. "I'm not here to propose marriage," he said before Annalisa could even process why she had been summoned. "I need to be clear about that from the start." Annalisa felt something she could not quite identify. Relief mixed with something else. Something that might have been disappointment. "Then why am I here, sir?" she asked in English. "I've been reviewing camp records," Thomas said. "I've read your file. You were a clerk in communications. You speak fluent English. You have education beyond what most of the women here received. I'm working on a project in Hamburg, coordinating between British administration and German civilian authorities. We need translators, people who understand both how the British system works and how German civilians think and operate. I'm wondering if you would be interested in that kind of work." As part of a work contract, Anna asked carefully. "Yes, but more specialized than the standard labor contracts. You would be classified as administrative staff, work directly with civil affairs officers, receive better wages and housing than standard laborers. You would have considerably more independence than most contracted workers. And if I accept, you would be transferred to Hamburg, assigned to our civil affairs office, given accommodation in a building we've requisitioned for administrative staff. You would work as a liaison and translator between British authorities and German civilian workers. Help us understand local conditions. Help local Germans understand what we require. You would be paid in British military script which can be exchanged for marks or saved. You would have the freedom to move within designated zones, considerably more autonomy than you have here." "It sounds," Annalisa said carefully, "almost too good to be true." Thomas smiled slightly. "It probably is in some respects. The work will be difficult. You will be caught between 2 sides, neither of which will entirely trust you. But it is what I'm offering. What you do with the offer is entirely your decision." Annalisa accepted. 4 days later, she left the camp not as a bride and not as a repatriated intern, but as something unexpected, a worker with specialized skills. A woman choosing her own path through the complicated terrain of occupied Germany. The work in Hamburg was harder than she had anticipated. The city was a landscape of ruins. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. The harbor choked with sunken ships. The population struggling to survive in cellars and makeshift shelters. The British Civil Affairs Office operated out of a requisition building that had somehow survived mostly intact, coordinating relief efforts, managing displaced persons, trying to establish some form of functioning administration in the chaos. Anisa found herself translating not just words, but entire systems of meaning. Helping British officers understand why German civilians approach problems in certain ways. Helping German workers understand what the British required and why. It was exhausting, frustrating work, caught constantly between competing expectations and mutual suspicion. It was in November during one of these translation sessions that she met Friedrich. He was not a British officer or a German civilian worker. He was something in between. A German doctor who had been conscripted late in the war, had served on the Eastern Front and had survived by being skilled enough and lucky enough to avoid death. He had returned to Hamburg to find his medical practice destroyed, his family scattered, his entire world reduced to ruins. Now he worked with the British Medical Services, helping coordinate health care for displaced persons and the civilian population. He was perhaps 45 with grey at his temples and eyes that had seen things that made his gaze seem to exist at a slight distance from the present moment. The first time they had a substantial conversation, it was because a conflict had erupted over the distribution of medical supplies. The British wanted to centralize distribution through their own channels. Friedrich insisted that local German doctors needed direct access to supplies to treat patients effectively. Tell him that centralized distribution ensures proper allocation, the British medical officer, Major Thornton, said to Annalisa. She translated, but Friedrich's response was more complex than simple disagreement. Tell him that centralized distribution ensures control, not proper allocation. The people dying of typhus in the cellars of Altona do not benefit from supplies sitting in a warehouse waiting for proper documentation. Major Thornton looked irritated. Friedrich waited. Annalisa found herself in the strange position of agreeing with Friedrich but understanding Thornton's constraints. Dr. Friedrich suggests Annalisa translated carefully that perhaps a hybrid system could work. Centralized control with delegated distribution authority to qualified local medical personnel. That way the British maintain oversight but supplies reach patients more efficiently. Something in how she said it made Friedrich look at her differently. After that, he began to seek her out during breaks, not asking her to translate, but simply to talk. He asked her where she had come from, what she had done during the war, whether she thought Germany would ever recover from what had been done and what had been done to it. I think Germany will recover, Annalisa answered honestly. But I think we will become something different. We cannot return to what we were. That's a dangerous thing to say to a stranger, Friedrich replied. Perhaps, Annalisa said, but you asked for honesty, not safety. By December, they were having real conversations. Friedrich had lost his wife and daughter in the bombing of Hamburg in 1943, the firestorm that had killed tens of thousands in a single night. He had been at the front when it happened, had learned about it weeks later through a Red Cross notification. He lived now in a partially destroyed apartment building in Eppendorf, heated by a small stove, furnished with salvaged remnants of what had been his life. I shouldn't be talking to you like this, he said one day. You work for the British. I work for the British. We're both compromised in ways that make this complicated. I'm not sure anything isn't complicated now, Annalise replied. We're all compromised. We're all just trying to survive in circumstances none of us chose. You're very practical for someone your age. The war taught me to be practical. Annalisa said practicality was the price of survival. Friedrich smiled slightly. Yes, I understand that. In January 1947, when the camp was officially decommissioned and the remaining women were processed into work contracts or repatriation, Annalise was no longer there to witness it. She had moved into a small room in the requisition building in Hamburg with other administrative staff, had received her first proper wages, had begun the strange process of building a life that existed in the spaces between British control and German survival. Friedrich continued to work with the medical services, continued to seek out Annalisa during their overlapping schedules. Other people noticed. Some British officers made comments that were not entirely kind. Some German civilians looked at her with suspicion, seeing her as someone who had chosen the occupiers over her own people, but no one stopped it. In March, Friedrich asked her to marry him. It was not a romantic proposal. He explained it practically the way he explained most medical procedures. I am alone, he said. You are alone. Hamburg is destroyed but being rebuilt. We are both trying to survive in a city that barely exists. I think we could help each other survive. I think we understand each other in ways that would be difficult to explain to anyone else. I am not offering you romance. I am offering you partnership in survival. Annalisa considered this for a long moment. She had not expected to marry again. Had not expected to marry at all after Heinrich. But Friedrich was right. They understood each other. They had both seen enough of war and death to have no illusions about what life required. Yes, she said finally. But on one condition, we marry as equals. I am not your dependent. I am your partner. I continue my work. I maintain my independence. We build something together, not something where I simply become an extension of your life. Agreed. Friedrich said, that is exactly what I want as well. They were married in May 1947, a quiet civil ceremony at a Hamburg registry office with 2 colleagues as witnesses. There was no church, no family, none of the traditional elements that would have accompanied a German wedding before the war. It was simply administrative, the way everything in the post-war world had become administrative. Annalisa wrote to her brother, who had survived the war and was living in the British zone in the Rhineland, explaining what she had done. She wrote to the International Red Cross with information about other women from the camp, documenting what had happened, creating a record. She understood that history was being written by those who could document their own experiences, and she wanted her version to exist. But the most important writing was in her journal, which she kept in German, a private record of her thoughts and observations. I was detained by the British and offered marriage by British soldiers, she wrote in June 1947. I chose neither. I chose work, independence, the possibility of building my own life. And then, when I was free to choose for myself, I chose Friedrich, not because I needed rescue, but because I wanted partnership. The British system, for all its rules and procedures, allowed me to refuse their offers and make my own choice. That is not freedom, not in any absolute sense. But it is something closer to agency than I expected to find in defeat. Other women from the camp had made different choices. Frida, the woman who had married Sergeant Campbell, had moved with him to Scotland, where she was learning to navigate a culture entirely foreign to her, trying to build a life in a place where many people still hated Germans. She wrote to Anneliese occasionally, letters that described both the difficulties and the unexpected kindnesses she had found. Helga, who had refused all marriage proposals, had been repatriated to the Soviet zone, where she was working as a nurse in Berlin. Her letters were more guarded, more careful, but she wrote that she had made the right choice for herself, that she would rather face the hardships of the Soviet zone as a free German woman than live comfortably as a British soldier's wife. News filtered back through various channels. Some marriages had worked, others had fallen apart quickly. Women who had married to escape detention sometimes discovered that marriage to a stranger was its own form of captivity. Divorces were beginning to happen, though they were complicated by the legal tangles of occupation law. But the system itself, the strange machinery that Colonel Dalton had implemented, had done what bureaucracies sometimes do. It had created unintended opportunities. By offering marriage as an option rather than imposing it, by allowing women to refuse, by creating space for different kinds of choices, the British had inadvertently created conditions where some women could exercise limited agency. Annalisa had been fortunate, though she did not think of it as luck. She thought of it as having skills the occupation needed and having the intelligence to translate those skills into opportunity. By the summer of 1947, she had stopped thinking of herself as a former intern. She was a worker, a translator, a wife, a woman building a life in a city rebuilding itself. The occupation was becoming normalized. The question of who she had been during the war was slowly being replaced by the question of who she would become in whatever Germany emerged from the ruins. Friedrich's nephew, Peter, arrived in Hamburg in August. He was 16, thin and haunted. His parents dead in the war, no other family remaining. Friedrich had not seen him in 4 years. The 3 of them stood in the small apartment, uncertain how to become a family. My uncle says you chose to marry him, Peter said in careful English. That you were not forced. That's correct. Annalisa said, I was offered many options. I chose to work first to become independent. Then I chose your uncle because I believed we could build something honest together. Peter nodded slowly. My uncle is a good man. He saved many people during the war. I think you made a good choice. I think so too, Annalise said. In September, on the first anniversary of Colonel Dalton's announcement, Anna thought about the women who had made different choices, the women who had married British soldiers to escape, the women who had been repatriated, the women who had disappeared into work contracts and had not been heard from since. She thought about the fundamental strangeness of the situation, the way defeat had created conditions under which marriage became an option rather than an obligation, a choice rather than an inevitability. She thought about what it meant that the British had allowed this, that they had not prevented marriages, but had also not forced them, had created a bureaucratic framework that acknowledged both control and consent. She understood this was not because the British were inherently more humane than other powers. It was simply that their particular form of administration, their obsession with proper procedure and legal correctness, had created spaces where agency could sometimes emerge. Years later, Annalisa would tell this story to her son, born in 1950, a child with his father's serious expression and her pragmatic temperament. I was detained after the war, she would say. And the British offered me choices. Not unlimited choices, not freedom in the way we think of it now, but genuine choices nonetheless. I chose to work rather than to marry. I chose to build independence rather than to seek security through a British husband. And then when I had built that independence, I chose to marry a German man who understood what I had survived and what I wanted to become. But you were still under British control, her son would say. Yes, Annalisa would agree. But within that control, there were spaces where I could choose, and those spaces made all the difference. The occupation continued for years. Slowly, German sovereignty was restored, though always partially, always conditionally. The work contracts became regular employment. The reconstruction projects became businesses. The displaced persons camps closed and their populations moved forward or moved back depending on where they could go. Annalisa and Friedrich bought a small house in Eppendorf, one of the buildings that had been repaired through the reconstruction efforts Friedrich had helped coordinate. Peter studied engineering and eventually worked on reconstruction projects throughout Germany. The marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement between two survivors, deepened into something more substantial, though it never became the kind of romance that novels celebrated. It was instead a daily choosing to remain, to work together, to build something that had not existed before. In 1953, 6 years after the war ended, Annala received a letter from a researcher at the University of London. They were documenting the experiences of German women interns, trying to create a historical record of what had occurred in the various camps during the occupation. They had found her name in British military records and wanted to know if she would participate in an interview. She agreed. And a young woman from London came to Hamburg and recorded her testimony, asking specifically about the marriage proposal system, about Colonel Dalton, about how she had experienced the transition from intern to worker to independent woman. I was never forced into marriage, Anisa said carefully during the interview. I was offered options and I chose the one that gave me the most independence. But I recognize I was fortunate. I had education, language skills, professional experience. Many women did not have those advantages. For them, marriage to a British soldier may have seemed like the only viable option, even if it was technically a choice. Do you believe the British system was ethical? The researcher asked. Annalisa considered this carefully. I believe it was procedural. The British are very good at procedure. They created a system that followed their rules, that appeared to respect choice, that allowed them to solve a practical problem while maintaining their sense of legal propriety. Whether that makes it ethical is a different question. Some women benefited from that system. Others were harmed by it. I was one of the fortunate ones who could navigate it successfully. After the interview, Annalisa thought more deeply about the question. She thought about the towel the British had issued her, still folded in a cupboard somewhere, a reminder of that first day of detention. She thought about Colonel Dalton's careful explanation, his insistence on procedure and proper forms. She thought about Friedrich, who had treated her as an equal rather than as a prize or a dependent. She understood that what had happened was neither evil nor good in any absolute sense. It was complex, ambiguous, filled with unintended consequences and unexpected possibilities. It was the way the world actually worked when systems broke down and people had to improvise within the constraints of bureaucracy and survival. The interview was published as part of a historical study in 1955, and Annalisa found herself briefly known as one of the documented voices of German women interns. Women she had known in the camp reached out, some to share their own stories, some to compare experiences, some simply to remember that moment when they had been offered choices and had made decisions that changed their lives. Helga wrote from East Berlin, describing her work as a nurse, the difficulties of life in the Soviet zone, her conviction that she had made the right choice in refusing marriage and accepting repatriation. "I live under different constraints now," she wrote, "but I live as myself as a German woman in Germany. That matters to me in ways I cannot fully explain." Frida wrote from Scotland, describing her children, her slowly improving English, her complicated relationship with Campbell's family, who had never entirely accepted her. "I married to escape," she wrote. "But I have stayed because I learned to adapt. I do not know if I love him in the way that novels describe love, but we have built something real together. That is enough." Annalisa kept these letters, adding them to her private archive, her attempt to document what it had meant to be a German woman internee in the British occupation zone, to be offered marriage as an option, and to navigate what that option meant. She watched Germany divide itself, watched the British zone become part of West Germany, watched the country slowly rebuild and eventually prosper. She watched her children grow up in a Germany that was not at war, that had running water and electricity, and the possibility of futures that were not determined entirely by the circumstances of their parents' defeat. And she remembered the moment when Colonel Dalton had announced the marriage system, when she had felt fear and confusion and the strange possibility of agency emerging from catastrophe. She understood that what had happened was not unique, that throughout history, women had been offered marriages as solutions to political problems. But she also understood that the British occupation zone had created something particular, a bureaucratic apparatus that was willing to let women refuse, to let women choose differently than expected, to create procedural space for agency even within constraint. This was not because the British were inherently better than other powers, but because their particular administrative culture, their obsession with proper procedure and legal frameworks, sometimes inadvertently created opportunities that had not been intended. In her final years, Annalisa wrote a memoir, though she never published it. She wrote it for her family, for the historical record, for herself, a comprehensive account of what it had meant to be her, to live through war and defeat and occupation and emergence. "They detained us and offered us marriage," she wrote in the final chapter. "This was not liberation. It was not even particularly kind. It was simply bureaucracy attempting to solve a problem. But within that bureaucracy, some of us found spaces where we could choose. And for those of us who found those spaces, we were forever changed. We carry the knowledge that even in systems of control, agency can sometimes emerge. This knowledge is both gift and burden. It means we can never fully believe that our fates are entirely predetermined. It means we must always fight for the possibility of choice, even when the choices available are limited and imperfect." She died in 1992, just as Europe was being transformed again, just as Germany was finding its place in a new European order. Her son found the memoir among her papers and read it for the first time, understanding his mother in a way that a lifetime of conversations had never quite achieved. And in that memoir, preserved now in family archives, the story survives of what happened when one British colonel decided that the problem of German women internees could be solved not through forced repatriation alone, but through the offer of choices, constrained though they were, limited though they might be, but procedurally correct nonetheless. It is a strange historical moment, unusual in its implications, significant in ways that its architects probably never fully understood. And it stands as a reminder that even in the darkest times, when systems of destruction and constraint are at their most powerful, there can be unexpected openings, moments when women can choose, when prisoners can become workers, when the future becomes something other than what was planned. The towel remained in Anai's cupboard for many years, a reminder of that moment when she was offered one set of choices and discovered that other choices were possible. It was never discarded. It was simply kept proof that it had happened, that there had been that moment of confusion and fear, and then the slow emergence into a different kind of life, one built on choices made as freely as any of us can ever make them within the constraints of history and circumstance and survival.